My guest on this episode of Living Peace Podcast is David Hoffman. David Hoffman is the founder of Boston Law Collaborative and a lecturer at Harvard Law School, where he teaches courses on mediation and collaborative law and is part of the Harvard Negotiation Project. David is the author of 3 books, including Bringing Peace into the Room: How the Personal Qualities of the Mediator Impact the Process of Conflict Resolution. He is an internationally renowned peace educator, TED speaker, mediator, collaborative lawyer, and a scholar of dispute resolution. You can learn more about David at www.blc.law. David Hoffman, welcome to Living Peace Podcast.
Thank you. It's good to be here.
Thank you. So you are probably one of the best known peacemakers. You do a lot of teaching and writing about being a peacemaker and also being a lawyer at the same time. So I'm wondering if, to start, you could share a little bit with us about how you got here, how you became a peacemaker.
So I'm a child of the 60s. I grew up, I was born in 1947, and so in my teenage years, all of the protest and ferment and the anti-war movement were all around me in Baltimore, Maryland, where I grew up. I was particularly affected by the civil rights movement. My friends and I marched in picket lines to oppose race discrimination. And at around that same time, the war in Vietnam became the focus of a lot of protest activity also. And I think that there was a fundamental tension in the 60s movement, and that tension exists today among progressive political people, and that is the yearning for world peace, and also the recognition that there are certain struggles that need to take place in order to achieve justice. And that tension between seeking social justice and seeking a more peaceful world is a very dynamic tension, and one that I'm still trying to sort out in my own life.
So, David, how would you define a peacemaker? Again, considering this tension between social justice and our desire to connect with each other, and to connect with each other in a meaningful way, how would you define a peacemaker?
So, for me, being a peacemaker is part of my journey of trying to find what the Buddhists call right livelihood. And so initially that took me to graduate school to become a teacher. And I thought that that would be a good setting in which to promote social justice and the work of making the planet more peaceful. I transitioned into woodworking because the market for academics wasn't so great in the 1970s. And I loved doing that, and brought to that work a similar interest in how can the workplace become a more collaborative and more peaceful space. And so I incorporated into my little cottage industry woodworking business elements of worker self-management and consensus, decision-making by consensus, which is a little unusual for business, but it was very rewarding. After about 7 years of being a woodworker, that yearning for right livelihood evolved as I began to realize that I wanted to be more involved in the world than I could be as a woodworker. I decided to go to law school. And my goal in deciding to go to law school was very straightforward. I wanted to be an advocate for civil rights, civil liberties, and for social justice. I knew that it would be hard making a living doing that, and I had a family at the time, still do. So I chose to go to a law firm, but do a lot of pro bono work, and that was very rewarding. It was a little bit out of sync with who I am as a person, however, because a steady diet of litigation, even on behalf of righteous causes, led me to think, and it's led many people to think, that litigation is not the most suitable tool for resolving conflict and advancing important goals. There's certain test cases, of course. I mean, the classic example of that is Brown versus Board of Education. There was no interest on anyone's part in mediating Brown versus Board of Education. And in my career as a lawyer, I handled some cases like, not of the level of Brown versus Board of Education, but cases that made precedent, established precedent. So I don't have any misgivings about the value of courts or the value of litigators. We certainly need both. But what I came to realize, as many lawyers have, is that the vast majority of cases really need a problem-solving, interest-based conversation, particularly one that we engage in, at least to some extent, from the heart and not solely from the head. And that led me to the path of getting training in mediation, arbitration, other kinds of alternative dispute resolution. And that has led me to be teaching and writing about those subjects. So I don't know whether there will be other twists and turns on the path, on the journey, but for now I feel like I'm in a place where my day job also feels like my calling. It feels like what feels right. It feels like right livelihood to be able to bring peace into the room through mediation and even through lawyering. Collaborative lawyering creates a similar opportunity.
And so, something that I take from what you said, and something that I also take from your writing, being a peacemaker could have something to do with the work that we do and how we show up to that work. But it sounds like an important piece of that is also how we are. So in other words, some people may find different disciplines more suitable, different careers more suitable, but yet we can show up to woodmaking as peacemakers. We can show up to litigation as peacemaking, and really to all areas of life. So do you have any thoughts, any additional thoughts on that peacemaker is more than what we do, it's more than a career choice, it's how we are?
So the book Bringing Peace into the Room, which I published with Daniel Bowling, makes a point similar to what you were just saying, which is that, well, in the book we talk about 3 stages of development for mediators, but I think it applies, as you point out, to other folks as well. One is skills. Second is understanding the theory behind what we're doing. And the third is the personal development that enables us, just by the kind of presence that we bring into a room, to influence people in a positive, healing direction. And in saying that, I want to be clear about something that may not be obvious, which is that peacemakers aren't all cut from the same cloth. People who, in their work as lawyers, mediators, woodworkers, etc., have a lot of different styles of how to do that. I took a workshop not too long ago with a therapist named Mike Elkin, who's a very accomplished psychotherapist. And his manner is not like, someone who, not like a Buddhist monk, let's say. He is very direct, but lovingly direct. And he is a way of bringing peace into the room with just a different kind of style. And I've learned a lot from Mike and really appreciate watching him do what he does. But we all draw from different sources the inspiration that enables us to bring peace into the room in whatever rooms we happen to be living and working in. I also want to say one other thing about the effort to be a peacemaker. Not only are there different styles of how to do it, but there are a number of different dimensions to what's going on as we do it. I think one of the biggest dimensions has to do with understanding better the parts of us that are competing for our attention, that may be angry or defensive or bored or distracted. We all have these different parts, and in order to truly be present for the people we're working with, the task is to be aware of those parts and ask them to step back, create some space, some heart space, so to speak, for a genuine self-to-self connection with the person or the people we're working with. So there's a lot of self-awareness that's part of what we are trying to do. The other dimension has to do with our awareness of other people's parts and how those parts, whether they're angry parts or depressed parts or hyper-rational parts, how they can occlude or block the kind of heart-to-heart energy that we try to open up when we're connecting with people. And recognizing that those are parts and having compassion that just like we have those parts, so do they. And then the other dimension is the skill with which we can help those parts, our own and the other person's parts, relax a little bit. And I wish there were, I mean, there are clinical texts for, how psychotherapists can accomplish this. But for people who don't have that kind of psychological training, I think the path has been spiritual awareness as an avenue. And that's valuable. It's very important. And it's very helpful if the other person also is on a spiritual path. But if the other person isn't on a spiritual path, I think there are techniques in the world of psychology that can enable us to help the other person be less defensive and to disengage those protective parts that stand in the way of authentic and heartfelt connection. Does that make sense?
Yes. And I think, David, you touched on two things that really, for me personally, have been absolutely key in the way I practice mediation as a craft and the way I also show up as a peacemaker. And one thing that you mentioned is space. I find that space is perhaps the most important element of mediation. Holding space for ourselves, having that, and then having that space between our story and us. And that allows us to hold space as peacemakers. And then the second piece, something that you mentioned and something that you write in your book, really caused me to re-examine the purpose of mediation. And I no longer see the purpose of mediation as settlement, coming to agreement, or even coming to understanding. But for me, the purpose of mediation and peacemaking has become expansion. So if we can come into the room and as peacemakers, we can somehow expand our understanding, expand our awareness, or if any other person in the room can expand where they are, to me, that's a successful experience, something that we can aspire to. So I'm wondering, do you have any comments on that?
Yes, I do. I, too, feel like I'm doing my work as a mediator differently now than I used to. And I'll describe that difference in just a moment. But first, I want to go to your point about how, in your practice, the goal of mediation isn't problem solving. It's some kind of higher level of awareness, understanding, expansion, etc. And this is very similar to what the transformative mediation movement is all about. Empowerment, recognition, and authors of The Promise of Mediation, Joe Folger and Robert Ruth Bush, say that mediators who are focusing primarily or solely on problem solving are really missing an opportunity that's unique to mediation. And so I guess I'm troubled when people say that there's a right way to mediate.
Right.
And the reason I'm troubled by that is that people come with different goals. And part of our skill as mediators is to figure out, how is this a process that can be useful in helping them achieve their goals? The vast majority, I mean, virtually all of the people who come to me for mediation are coming because they have a conflict that needs to be resolved. Sometimes, occasionally, I do family, commercial, employment, I do all kinds of cases, and I like the variety. Occasionally, I've had married couples come, not because they needed an amicable divorce, but because they wanted to mediate the terms of their marriage. And because there were conflicts. And so the tools of expansion, which is your term, or empowerment and recognition, which is the terms used in transformative mediation, I think of all of those concepts as extremely valuable and important tools. And at the same time, I see my goal, it's not my goal exactly, it's my role, it's my job. I've been hired to help people resolve a specific conflict. Now, if they can do it amicably, if they can do it in a way that is emotionally or even spiritually enriching, transformative, to use the Bush-Folger term, that's terrific. Those are the golden moments for mediators, when people not only shake hands, but give each other a hug and really reconnect in some way. And mediators, I'm sure you've experienced this too. It's really deeply energizing, deeply satisfying to accomplish that. But there are an awful lot of cases that simply result in settlements. And I think that's fine. I don't judge that. So as to how I do it, let me turn back to that for a moment. So when I was trained as a mediator, I think the role that I internalized was that, like in a courtroom, you have two advocates and you have a judge and jury, and they're the deciders. In mediation, you have often two parties, and the mediator is there to advocate for or explore the space where the parties can meet, to be an advocate for settlement. And so when one side says, we think we're going to win, the mediator's role, in my old view, was to raise questions, ask reality testing questions, kind of see how confident they really were and whether their confidence was realistic. And then I'd go to the other side and do the same thing. And what I found was, over the years, that way of thinking about my role had a certain oppositional quality. I was trying to persuade them of something, and the harder I tried to persuade them, the harder they would push back. And it became a struggle of will, which didn't feel like the best way to mediate. And so I had this moment in one of my mediations where the light went on, so to speak, and I saw a different way of doing it. I was sitting with a woman who's a fairly senior manager in a large corporation, and she had been let go. She had been laid off. The company said they eliminated her position, and she said, well, what they really did was they just created a new position and hired a man. And so she was asserting sex discrimination, and she had a case which appeared to be quite strong because the company offered a lot of money to settle it. That's usually a pretty good indication that they feel they have some exposure. And we got to the end of the day, and this woman, who was the primary breadwinner in her family and who was very concerned about how the litigation could take a couple of years or more with no certainty as to result. We had reached the end of the road, and the company had offered $250,000, which for her was, significant sum, would enable her to make her mortgage payments and keep her family going for quite a while she looked for her next gig. But I could see her really struggling, really wrestling, because she believed so fervently that she had been discriminated against. Felt unfair. She had an excellent lawyer, and I sat with her lawyer and with her, and we talked. And I said, I think there's a part of you that really wants to go the distance on this, because that part of you cares passionately about justice. And that part of you is very worried that if you settle this case, you're giving up on an important cause. And she said, yes, that's true. And I said, and I sense that there's another part of you that is trying to be very practical about the risks of going to trial and the need to support your family, and is very concerned that fighting the good fight will create problems, serious problems for you at home. And she said, yes, there's definitely a part of me that is very concerned about that. So I said, I think that all of us have a mediator inside, a wise, calm, centered part of us that can listen to these two parts that are in conflict and help the whole system come to a wise decision about the path that makes sense here. And I wonder if you can feel that mediator inside you. And she said, yes. I said, I know I need to settle this and move on. And it was that moment of reflection when she sat in silence with her inner mediator, letting that work go on inside, that really both moved me and inspired me. It was moving because I could see that she was making an empowered decision. She was making a decision where she didn't feel like she was being pushed around by the mediator or her lawyer or anybody else. She really kind of took it all in, and she was at peace with her decision. And so that was really quite touching. For me, what it meant was that I could step out of the role of being an advocate for one path or the other path, but just help illuminate both paths. And that felt really wonderful. It felt more in alignment with my personal, emotional, spiritual values than simply being, in a way, kind of a lawyer advocating for a certain outcome, right? The outcome of settlement, as opposed to the outcome of, victory in court. And So I've begun to practice more in that way. And now Baruch Bush and Joe Folger, you might say, well, that's exactly what we're talking about, empowering people. And I agree. I see it as a very deep kind of empowerment, in the sense that people are getting in touch with their highest and best selves, and acknowledging all their parts, the parts that are angry, the parts that are wanting to resolve things.
And David, it sounds, when we as mediators are able to hold space for a person who's going through, allow space for that person to go through that deeply transformative process, by whatever name and technique and way we get there, or however we call it, what sort of practices can we as mediators, as peacemakers, do to create that space within ourselves to show up in that way? Yeah. I don't know if it's a clear question.
Yes, no, it is. So for me, there are a number of practices that are important. One is psychotherapy, getting a better sense of who I am, what makes me tick. And I've been blessed to have a relationship with a wonderful psychotherapist over the years. I started seeing her when one of my kids was going through a very hard time, and I was just struggling to maintain my composure and ability to, not just fall apart with sadness and worry. And this therapist helped me a lot, and I've continued to see her both to explore the dimension within, and also as kind of a coach, someone who has a more objective view of some of the things that I find myself needing to decide as I manage my journey. So I highly recommend that. And, psychotherapy has been stigmatized in our society, unfortunately, quite a bit, particularly for lawyers and other professionals. I think acknowledging that psychotherapy can be useful is becoming a little less uncommon, but still it's not sort of fully accepted. Everyone thinks it's fine to see a medical doctor to attend to our physical health, but the idea that we would want someone to see on a regular basis about our psychological well-being is not considered kind of routine at all. So that's one thing. Second thing is contemplative practice, making times for meditation or yoga or other kinds of time when we go within and become more peaceful. Third, I think we're remiss if we don't make some time for fun. And I think that's a part of being whole and feeling healthy and integrated and authentic. And finally, for me, being in love has been, a deeply enriching part of my life. I was blessed to be married to Beth Andrews for 34 years. She died 4 years ago from lung cancer, and it was the saddest thing I've ever experienced. I've lost my parents. I've lost other people in my life who were important to me, but I have not had anything as deeply wrenching as losing Beth. But I've reopened my heart, and I've recently remarried. And for me, that is a hugely important channel of peace and well-being, that feeling of interpersonal connection. Now, I should also say that I feel a very strong sense of interpersonal connection in my workplace, which is a very collaboratively oriented workplace. We call ourselves Boston Law Collaborative, intentionally, not just because of collaborative law, but because of our goal of managing the firm collaboratively. And I live in a co-housing community in the suburbs of Boston, 27 households, collectively managing a lovely space. We all have our own homes. And we have a common house. So it's a little bit like a cross between a commune and a condominium. And it's a wonderful way to live. So I feel blessed. I have sources of connection at home, in my marriage, in my workplace, and also in my the neighborhood that we created together. It's called New View Co-housing. If any of your listeners are interested in co-housing, just type co-housing into your browser and you'll find out a lot of cool things about it.
I will definitely look it up.
Okay.
Something that I also want to talk to you about, David. I've heard you speak many times, and I notice how vulnerable you can be when you're speaking, raw, vulnerable, how moved you can appear, and how moved you are by the stories you share of your clients, the stories that you share of your family. And so I'm wondering, what role do you see vulnerability playing in showing up as peace, showing up as a peacemaker to whatever is the situation, whatever life calls on us?
Yeah. Well, as I'm sure you know, Brene Brown has written and spoken very eloquently on this subject of vulnerability. And my own view about it is that the avenue to connecting with other people is to recognize those defensive and protective parts of our being stand in the way of connection. And so by asking those kinds of parts to step away, what's left are some very vulnerable parts. And some people are naturally more comfortable with their tears than others. And I have to say that for many years, decades even, I was not comfortable with my tears at all. I was embarrassed about them. And at some point, I don't recall exactly what led to this change, but I gradually became more comfortable with them and accepting that that's just kind of how I roll. I actually, as I think about it, I think that it was around the time that my kids started to have their bar and bat mitzvahs. And because as a parent, if you have a child having a bar or bat mitzvah, the child gives a talk, and usually the parents say something. And oh my gosh, I just fell apart. I just was so tearful. I mean, I managed to say a few things too, but the tears were just flowing. I think my then 13-year-old kids were probably a little bit mortified by that. But they also know that's kind of how Dad is. And I read a book called Tears, written by a psychologist. And I'm trying to remember the psychologist. Anyway, the psychologist wrote a whole book about it and how crying is stigmatized in our society, along with psychotherapy and some other things. And in this book, the psychologist told the story of a young doctor in training. I think he was a resident, and he was sitting at the bedside of a woman who was dying and counseling her and comforting her. And she was crying and he was crying. And the senior physician on that service came in and saw what was going on and was very angry and said to this resident, he said, "What the hell is going on here? You know, if you want to get emotional like this, you should go into nursing." And which spoke volumes about the way the practice of medicine is conceived of as an orientation where you aren't in empathic, vulnerable connection with your patients. That the hallmark of being a good doctor is that you can look at this patient of yours who's dying and not be moved by her sadness. And the same thing is true in law. I think the same norm applies. To quote, think like a lawyer, which is the main curriculum of law school. To think like a lawyer means to look at a situation that might be very sad or even seem unjust, but recognize that we have to apply the law. First-year law students are given texts that are full of accident cases in which horrible things have happened to people, and yet their case cannot proceed in court because they missed the statute of limitations by a day. Well, you know, why should one day matter, you know? But if one day doesn't matter, then what about 2 or 5 or 10 or 1,000 days, you know? And so we have to become desensitized to the injustice that sometimes results from a rigid application of the rule of law. And unfortunately, I think lawyers get trained to view their vulnerability and their emotions as suspect. So for mediators, there's this great saying I heard from a woman who was both a mediator and a lawyer. She said that for her, going to law school was an experience in which her left brain circled her right brain and ate it. and that what she was trying to accomplish as a mediator was to recover the right brain function that got gobbled up in law school. And I think that's a very apt and amusing way of thinking about it.
And I think what I discovered even in my own work and the courses that I teach, when we are able ourselves as peacemakers, as mediators, as lawyers, whatever is the particular role we're playing, when we are ourselves able to connect with what's inside us, whatever are the pieces that we're carrying, and realize that we carry pieces inside us, then we can bring peace.
Yeah.
Because if we don't have that awareness, I think it becomes very, very difficult. And then I've seen, as I'm sure you have, lawyers and others become very uncomfortable when someone displays some sort of emotion and they try to caucus and they try to immediately move to another direction and don't really give space. Space to someone's crying, to someone feeling sad, to someone feeling very angry.
Yeah. And I think when we encounter people who are very angry, a number of things happen for me anyway. One is they are telling a very distorted view of their situation. And so there's a part of me that is editing what they're saying and trying to discount and say, well, that can't possibly be completely true the way they're describing it. So there's a skeptic in me that is kind of filtering what I'm hearing. And that's not very helpful. And then there's another part of me that is getting upset with them because the more dug in and angry they get, the more positional they get, the harder it's going to be for me to do my job, to help the parties reach a resolution. And so those two, the combination of those two reactions is going to make it very difficult for me to bring forth the peaceful part of me. So I have to be aware of those parts and ask them to step back and to get curious, to get compassionate and curious, and ask myself, why is this person so angry? You know, what is the vulnerable part of this person that's being protected by these angry gladiators? And what's the fear? What's the sadness? What's the wound that this person is carrying around? And when I can open myself up to that curiosity and compassion, I have a better chance of working with that person rather than resisting or doubting what they're telling me. There's one other aspect of peacemaking that I want to address before we get done, because I know we're getting close to the end of our time. And that is the important goal of social justice, not only outside in the world that we all inhabit, but within our own spheres, within our communities, within our profession, within our peacemaking work. If one looks around at the ranks of mediators in the United States, we do not see the representation of people of all kinds that exists in our society. And I think we have to ask ourselves, how can we make our community of peacemakers more accurately reflect the communities in which we live and work? How are we going to serve all of the communities of our society if we don't have peacemakers that are drawn from communities of all kinds? And this has to do with race, with socioeconomic status, ethnicity, religion, disability, sexual orientation, gender identity. There's a whole range of dimensions in which we mediators are not representative, and we need to be opening the doors and welcoming people of all kinds. And beyond opening the doors and being welcoming is to be out there in outreach to underserved communities to create more peacemaking in all corners of our society. And then there's the work that we do for social justice that goes beyond our day job. Right now, as you and I speak, there's an important midterm election that's in the offing. There are struggles there was a recent struggle, of course, over the nomination of Brett Kavanaugh to the Supreme Court. These are struggles which bring to the fore many kinds of injustice in our society that need to be rectified. And so I'm reminded of a folk song written by a guy named Charlie King. And I won't try to sing it for you, but the lyrics of the chorus go like this. He said, our life is more than our work, and our work is more than our job. And so while I try to bring the values of peacemaking into my work as a mediator, which is my job, I try to bring it into my life at home and in my community. I think all of us need to take seriously what are our responsibilities for social justice in those areas that lie outside our job, outside our immediate communities in the larger world.
But I don't think I can add anything to that. It seems like that's a perfect place for us to pause. Certainly a lot to ponder after our conversation. David Hoffman, I'm so grateful for joining us on the Living Peace podcast. Thank you.
Thank you. Good to talk with you. So long.
Thank you.